Okie dokie. So we are back with Michael J. Bowen, and let's talk about the already mentioned the golden age of the adult video in New York. Let's talk a bit about, let's say, more interesting or more important people in that industry. Say about directors like we already mentioned, for example, Gerard Damiano, the director of the Deep Throat. We can talk about him.
Absolutely, yeah. You know the golden age of porn, and I'm glad to hear you mention to say in New York because New York really was the center for the production of most of the important films of that period. Most of the well-known porn films, outside of a couple of examples, were made in New York. So
Yeah.
I suspect if you talk to people in New York today about the history of filmmaking in New York, they would not like to admit that New York was the porno capital of the 1970s, but it really was. And part of the reason was because there actually were skilled filmmakers here and companies that rented all the professional equipment, et cetera, because there was already a kind of a, Hollywood, of course, was 90% of the film industry in America. But New York had its own small, robust film industry as well.
Yeah.
And porno was just another place for New York filmmakers to make a living making movies when they, couldn't really compete with Hollywood. That, of course, changed a lot by the mid 70s when you had New York became almost an open air studio for all of the new kind of gritty neo-realist, Martin Scorsese,
Yeah.
all these crime movies shot in New York, French Connection and Serpico, and then also, of course, Woody Allen. New York became very much a place where movies were made in the 70s, but in the 50s and 60s, it was, rare. So a lot of the important porn made for movie theaters in America in the 70s was made in New York City. Um, and yeah, there were, I would say, some noteworthy filmmakers who worked in that area. Again, porno movies were sold to the public based on the fact that they had hardcore sex in them, not because they were made by great directors.
Yeah.
Um, but there certainly were some interesting directors who made them. And in one case, actually, the case of Gerard Damiano, who directed Deep Throat famously, his early films actually were marketed as Gerard Damiano movies. Gerard Damiano did a great deal to legitimate pornography in America, whether he meant to or not. And in a sense, he meant to because he took his filmmaking very seriously. But as a byproduct of the fact that he took his filmmaking seriously, everybody ran around saying, "Oh, we have great filmmakers like Gerard Damiano making porn. Therefore, all porn is,
Yeah. Yeah. And has a value.
defendable,
Yeah, has a
right?
value.
It's et cetera, right?" But Gerard was a very sincere um, filmmaker who really did try to make excellent films. I got to speak to him on two occasions. Uh, Mostly to talk to him about subjects that specifically to talk about things that had bearing on my own specific research work at the time.
Mhm.
He's been dead now for many years, so I didn't talk about his whole career. But he was a very nice, soft-spoken man, and it's very clear that if you look at the media from that time, that he took his work very seriously. So Deep Throat is sort of a comedy, and it's a jokey film, and I would not say that it's a very sophisticated movie. But Gerard Damiano himself made that claim, right?
Mhm.
After the film became very successful, he said, "Oh no, I can do much better than this, and I intend to do better than this." And he immediately, and I would say not cynically, he didn't just do this to save himself from legal prosecution. He immediately began to make an effort to make more serious films. So his next important film, The Devil and Miss Jones,
Yes.
is a much more self-consciously made film from a stylistic point of view. And he worked very closely with the cinematographer named João Fernandes, who was born in Brazil, who was living and working in New York, and who actually worked with Doris Wishman before this time, by the way.
Mhm.
Very interesting. But Joao was very talented, took his work seriously, particularly the lighting, camera angles. And so they collaborated to make sincerely, cinematically complex, thoughtful movies. Devil and Miss Jones being the first of them, starring Georgina Spelvin, and then subsequently, you know, his films were increasingly marketed based on the notion that this is a Gerard Damiano film. He takes filmmaking seriously, and his porn films are both creative from a formal point of view, and they're revolutionary from the point of view of content, because they contain all of this hardcore, all of this hardcore sex. So he's certainly an important filmmaker. I think that Gerard Damiano wound up being a bit disappointed by the industry. I think he thought that his efforts would normalize sexual representation in the cinema to the extent that even Hollywood films would show sex scenes that had hardcore sex in them. And while Hollywood films sort of, you know, while the sex scenes in Hollywood films became stronger, it never went beyond simulated sex. And Hollywood was very leery about the famous X rating. Because the X rating limited the size of your audience. If you had to be over 18, or even in some cases 21, to see the movie, then there were a lot of younger people who were not going to be able to see that film, and Hollywood never wanted to lose a portion of its audience. So Gerard Damiano was wrong about Hollywood embracing hardcore sex. Also, maybe I'll say very briefly about X ratings, the X rating. Everybody in America knows that American movies have a rating. The original ratings were G, M, and X.
Yeah.
G was general audience, like a children's film like Walt Disney, or any other film that contained nothing objectionable or of an adult nature. You know, an M was for mature, and it was quickly changed to an R. I don't know why exactly.
Restricted, yeah.
But it meant that these films were more appropriate for adults, that kids might not even understand them. It wasn't just about sex, but foul language or violence, things that were not for children. And then X meant that the film dealt with adult subject matter. And in the earliest days of the X rating, even extreme violence could get an X rating.
And they did. And
they did. But it could very quickly morphed into a rating that simply meant pornographic sexual content. If a movie got an X rating, everybody went, oh, ho, ho, an X-rated movie. We know what that means. And so it became clear very quickly that this film had sex in it, and the size of the audience that could see it was now limited. Not by law, but by convention. The movie theaters agreed not to let kids in. They had an agreement with Hollywood that they wouldn't let kids in.
Yeah.
So Hollywood began to shy away from X very quickly. I actually have a large collection of all the original X-rated movies that had an X rating from what we call the MPAA, the Motion Picture Producers Association, right?
America, yeah.
I have a collection of posters and press books for those movies, because by about 1974 or so, say around the time of Last Tango in Paris, it became unfashionable to get an X rating on your movies. The studios went out of their way even to cut the films to turn that X into an R.
Yeah.
Because there were movie theaters that wouldn't even show an X-rated film. They just wouldn't do it because it had a negative connotation. That is all very different, however, from what we're talking about, which are pornographic movies that were designed to be sold as pornographic movies, which are sometimes called X-rated, but they began to adopt a triple X rating, which, by the way, was completely fabricated. There is no such rating, according to the Motion Picture Association of America. The pornography industry created the X rating to say, hey, our movies they're so dirty, we're giving you 3 X's, right?
For the same amount of money, yeah.
For the same amount. Well, no, they were still more expensive. Because a real porno theater never would have shown Last Tango in Paris or any X-rated film that came out of the legitimate film industry, the mainstream film industry. They
not dirty enough, yeah.
Right. There were many European films in 1970, 71 that received an X rating because they were just considered to be a little bit too strong for the R. And they accepted the X, but then, you know, it turned out that the audience didn't come out. It was better to get an R.
Yeah.
And I don't quite remember how the M morphed into the R. And then in the 70s, they created this rating called PG.
PG-13.
And then PG-13 later. So PG was in between a G and an R. Yes. Like it was okay for teenagers was the suggestion, not just 4-year-olds, but teenagers. And then the R, maybe you should be 17.
Yes.
You know, anyway, it got complicated. But the XXX films were nothing but hardcore pornography. So they were oftentimes called X-rated movies, and the legitimate X rating disappeared real quickly. By the mid-70s, you almost never see it. Every now and then it would rear its head. But very few films coming out of the mainstream industry had it, and only porno films basically were X-rated films after that, even though they never submitted themselves to the Motion Picture Producers Association to get a rating. Because the Motion Picture Producers Association said anybody can put an X on their film. We don't want, if you think it's so dirty it's going to get an X, go ahead, put an X on it yourself. We don't want to see it. We don't want to sit here all day watching pornography.
Yeah.
Right? Because, you know, they had to watch the films and judge them and evaluate them. So pornographers created their own XXX rating. Gerard Damiano was probably the best known XXX director of the era, which is called the Golden Age.
Yes.
For a lot of reasons, but by the 80s, particularly because video came along, then it became clear after a while that there was something a little bit better about these 35 millimeter movies that you'd see in a movie theater. And so it was
at least a real filmmaking, so to speak.
Real filmmaking. And that's really true, by the way. If you're going to make a 35 millimeter feature, you need a camera operator who really knows how to run a 35 millimeter camera. You need lighting people who really know about lighting. You need sound recordists and sound mixers who really know about sound on a professional level. So, you know, you couldn't really fake it. You needed to put together a professional movie crew to make those kind of movies and to edit them. And then you sent them to professional laboratories to prepare the prints for the theaters. You know, you weren't fooling around. You could still make a terrible movie, but you needed to make it using professional equipment and real technicians, basically.
Okay, but
that's what Damiano's career kind of celebrates: the meeting of professional technology and porn film production.
Yeah. Okay, but
a high level of technical proficiency in the movies. That's what Damiano championed, and also some creative technique as well.
Yeah. Okay, but we're talking 35 mil here. But how about 16 millimeters? Now we can talk about Sean Costello, for example, as a example.
Great question. Great question. There were movie theaters operating in the 70s as well that did not use 35 millimeter projectors, so they could not show 35 millimeter professional movies. They were showing cheaper films shot on 16 millimeter, which, by the way, is better than 8 millimeter. 16 millimeter already had a tradition in this country as being a kind of in-between, we'll call it semi-professional medium. Mm-hmm. It was a lot more expensive than home movies, but the quality was not as good. So most people would go make 35 millimeter if they wanted to make a professional film. But like there were many
cost more, yeah.
Cost more, but there were many types of films that were professional films that were made in 16 millimeter, and lower budget porn began to colonize the 16 millimeter world because it was cheaper to make, and also the expectations were lower. So you had loops that were being shown in the adult bookstores or that people were buying and taking home. But then you also had this low tier of cinemas. They were usually created out of a space that was not a traditional theater, but all you needed to do was put a projector in the back of the room, put a screen in the front, get some seats, some chairs, and you had a movie theater, right? So these theaters were showing 16 millimeter films. Sometimes they were features, but a lot of times they were just a series of loops, really, that were kind of all spliced together. Yeah. But there were people who made films for that market that had something of a storyline. And probably the best known director who was working in 16 millimeter making more interesting films that had some semblance of a storyline was Sean Costello, a New York-based filmmaker, a fairly young guy who started off, I think, appearing in loops, as a sex worker actor, and then had the sensibility, the smarts, the desire to become a producer-director. And he apparently made an arrangement with a distributor of those films who also did have organized crime connections to make films almost exclusively for this distributor, to make sure that this distributor had a regular, consistent flow of new movies coming into the pipeline that they could then distribute to the theaters they were servicing. And Sean Costello made films for that market. Sean was young. The people he worked with were young. They all smoked pot and thought it was funny to make sex films, and they were these free love hippies. So the films have a very different feel than maybe Gerard Damiano's films. Don't forget, Damiano was already a middle-aged man by the time he was making these movies. So he was working with younger people, but let's say his sensibility was different. But Sean Costello films have the sensibility of a kind of underground movie of the time, like an Andy Warhol film. They're crazy, they're fun, they're loose, they're hippie.
Unhinged.
I mean, not just the sex, but the sensibility of the filmmaking. Let's make something crazy. Let's make something with handheld cinematography. Let's have a lot of jokes in the movie. Let's make the filmmaking itself kind of a joke, etc. So that I would say was Sean Costello's main contribution. Like, he represented a new generation of filmmakers, hippie, young, fresh, crazy, free, that handheld, shot from the hip, cynical but ironic, funny sensibility. Yeah, and the films also sometimes have very strong sexual content, very frank, very frank, like not trying to make it look beautiful at all. Gerard Damiano,
no holds barred. Yeah,
right. Gerard tried to aestheticize it in some ways, beautiful lighting, etc. No, these films are, sex in all of its gritty, funky, hippie frankness, right? Yeah, exactly. So I think of him as a significant filmmaker. By the mid-70s, he had graduated to some 35 millimeter production and was upping his game, as we say. I don't know that the films are better in a certain sense. They don't feel as fresh and original and unique. They feel a little bit more like the standard high quality production of the period. But good for him for having learned new skills and tried to make a film that involved more technique that he wanted to learn about. Other early filmmakers that are noteworthy are like Carter Stevens.
Yeah, we already mentioned him. Yes.
Yes, who was very early, and again, not a traditional filmmaker. He actually had a background, though, in photography. He had worked in a film laboratory, so he understood the technical side of filmmaking, at least from the, point of view of lighting and development, etc. He understood certain parts of filmmaking technique quite well. He was a younger guy, but not exactly a hippie type guy. Very sincere interest in trying to make movies. He had also began his career by appearing in low-budget loops and sex films as an actor. He was, not a traditionally handsome man, a little bit round in the middle, and not a very handsome face. So he was kind of a character who stood out in the films. But he was a lovely guy whom I got to know quite well later in his life. And again, sincerely wanted to make movies. And this was his opportunity. He knew He knew just enough about filmmaking and knew just enough people to get into porn, not any other part of the film business. And he used that as a springboard to try to make movies. And I think his movies are quite nice. By the way, I should mention that most of his early films from the 70s were actually shot by a cinematographer who worked with Joe Sarna very regularly in the mid-1960s.
Mm-hmm.
So he's working with somebody who had the talent to work with Joe Sarna and who took filmmaking very seriously. The man's name was Bruce Sparks. He's no longer alive. Spark, like a spark plug.
Yeah, I got it.
That's his real name. He used a pseudonym on Carter's films because he was concerned about both the legal ramifications of working on porn, and also maybe he didn't entirely want his name to be associated with porno.
You don't really want to go there with the family there, you know.
If you had aspirations of working in other parts of the film business or in the television industry, at that time you tried to hide the fact that you worked on porno, at least hide it in public. You probably could mention it to other people casually.
Yeah.
You know, and I know that Bruce Sparks worked in network television here in New York, and that wasn't something you put on your resume at the time.
I would say you don't put it on the resume even today. So
it's possible. Again, people are a little bit more open-minded about it. But when I was first reaching out to some of these people, they were surprised that I found out who they were because they tried to hide their identity. And maybe I played a little role in convincing them that nobody thought badly of them anymore because they had worked in these films. And actually, if they did interesting work, there was a reason to be proud of it, you know. So I knew Bruce, interviewed him, you know, at some length. He was very helpful. And I think that, yes, he understood that he had done something of value, even working with Carter on these porno films. People like Damiano, people like Carter Stevens, people like Sean Costello, most of them at different points worked with a lot of the same actors in these films.
I think that the talent pool was not really big, you know. So
it was fairly small, and there was kind of like a repertory company here in New York. People you would see time and time and time again in all the different porn films produced here. Harry Reams, very famous for Deep Throat, but he was in everybody's movies, including he worked with Doris Wishman before. You know, even Doris made a couple of porn films under a pseudonym trying to hide her identity.
Yes.
So he worked with Doris, but even before porno.
Jamie Gillis.
Jamie Gillis, right, became very well known and worked with everybody, including people like Sarno. Joe Sarna, using pseudonyms, didn't use the name Joe Sarna, crossed over into porn and made a lot of porno movies, and he worked with Jamie, who was in everybody's movies. A lovely guy, very intense, but a very nice guy. I had the chance to meet him, hang out with him, talk to him a few times. Also passed away some years ago, like Harry Reams. These are some of the better known. Jeff Eagle, also known as Jeffrey Hurst, in a lot of films, very talented actor who had aspirations of becoming a regular actor in mainstream films, right? Very nice guy. All of them were nice people. They were, you know, byproducts of that 60s hippie generation. They figured everybody would think having sex was cool, it was normal, that porno would be normalized. Of course, it wasn't really entirely normalized, but they were very sincere. And, you know, Jeff Hurst, I mentioned because he worked, you know, with Carter, he worked with everybody. A very talented actor who deserves a lot of credit for the skill he brought to the different roles. And also he liked to do comedy as well. And other people I could mention. Then the women, you know, of course, I think of Tina Russell, one of the first porn stars coming. She's from Pennsylvania, but came to New York to go to New York University, wound up doing photo shoots for the men's magazines, and then in doing loops, she worked with her husband, known as Jason Russell. Those are not their real names, but they became very well known in the industry. And Tina Russell worked with everybody. A very pretty young woman. You know, there was a rumor that women who did porn were usually middle-aged strippers who were getting a little bit old, and they'd seen it all and done it all. They were kind of like burnt out old prostitutes. But Tina was fresh-faced and like a young, pretty hippie girl. And so she was very much in demand, and she developed a fan following because everybody recognized this pretty young brunette.
Yeah.
Also, Andrea True, who used different names.
Oh, yeah, that's a famous name.
Yes, she used different names early on in her films. She was a little bit older, not significantly, but a little bit older. She was blonde. But Andrea True was in everybody's sex films. And she became well known in the United States because she also had aspirations while she was making porn
As a
to
singer.
become a singer-songwriter.
Yes.
She wrote a number of songs, and she had a huge disco hit in the mid-'70s called More, More, More.
Yeah.
And I knew that song very well as a kid, but nobody on the radio mentioned, oh, and here's Andrea True, who also, by the way, has been in 40 hardcore porno movies.
No.
That was a little bit secret. Yeah. And once she became successful in popular music, although she never equaled the success of More, 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 she stopped making porn movies and left the porn industry entirely. But in later years, if you went back and looked at all these movies made in 73, 74, 75, she's working with Damiano. She's working with all of these people, right? She was a significant a figure in those films at the time. And also I should mention Georgina Spelvin, right, who starred in The Devil and Miss Jones. She was already an older woman, in her 30s for sure when that film was made, but a very sincere actress. I mean, who had also done singing and dancing and entertaining, had appeared on Broadway in a play, as a younger woman, and a very interesting, sincere lady I had a chance to correspond with over the years. She's still alive. She's, quite an older lady at this point. I think she should get recognition for her sincerity and the courage she showed coming out and appearing in these films at that time. And speaking of women, there's one other person I feel I should mention. In the sexploitation era in the 60s, there was a married couple named Michael and Roberta Findlay, who made some wonderful, extraordinary sexploitation films. Michael as the director and Roberta increasingly as the cinematographer. And that was quite rare at the time to find a woman cinematographer, camera operator. But they worked together as a team. They were a married couple. They split up in the early 70s, and Michael Findlay died quite young in a very bizarre helicopter accident. Yes. But Roberta went on to have a very dynamic career as a director of hardcore porn films here in New York. She still lives here in New York, and she made a number of hardcore films using different pseudonyms. And they're noteworthy, I would say, for their sense of humor particularly. Roberta felt that there was something very funny about making sex films, or that it somehow made the sex more palatable to have a lot of humor in your films. So she tended to make films with a certain amount of humor in them. But she was by far the most prolific woman director of hardcore porn films during that period. And again, everybody who was involved, all the actors who were involved in porn in the mid to later 70s worked with Roberta, and she was well known and quite a unique figure as a woman director. And she used to, for many years, didn't want to discuss her career in porn filmmaking. She actually got involved in the music industry, worked with a very famous recording studio that recorded a lot of rock music and jazz and other stuff. So she distanced herself, but in recent years has been willing to talk about her career and has apparently come to recognize that there are people who take her work seriously, who think very well of her efforts and whatnot. So I'm glad to see that she's talking about that. So, that's a very quick summary. I've skipped a lot of people of some of the more significant aspects of the golden age of porn based in New York at that time. There was a West Coast industry as well. I never studied that in my own work so much, but there were filmmakers in Los Angeles that are worth looking into. Bob Chin, the Asian American filmmaker.
I just finished his biography. I have to mention.
There you go. There you go. Very worthy. And also the Mitchell brothers up in San Francisco. They owned a movie theater and basically made movies to show in their own theater.
Yeah.
And they had a very interesting history. It's been the subject of a feature biopic. Also, there's a very nice biography about them, called Bottom Feeders, that you might want to check out, talking about their whole life and career. Very interesting. So there's documentation about that. But I focused through my academic career on what was happening in New York. And New York really was the biggest center for producing porn here in the 70s. So I mentioned mostly people from the 70s. And then, just maybe to wrap it up, filmmakers in New York continued to make movies on 35 millimeter film stock right up until the early 80s, even into the mid 80s. But what happened? Video. You could shoot a movie now on video, and videotape was virtually free compared to 35 millimeter film stock.
Video killed the movie star.
Video killed the movie star, exactly. And the money people realized very quickly that shooting on video made your film much, much, much cheaper to produce, and that distributing the films on videotape made it a lot easier for people to consume the movies because they didn't have to go jerk off in a movie theater.
Yeah, exactly.
They could rent the tape and bring it home, and they could do their business at home. Although for those who wanted to purchase a pornographic movie, say in the early 70s,
that was expensive
as hell. Very expensive. I mean, we're talking about $100 to buy a videotape at that time. If people want to go back and see what other things cost, like in 1982, I mean, I actually own a couple of original videotapes of Deep Throat, just because I have a Deep Throat collection. But these first videotape releases of Deep Throat, and one of them has a price tag on it. It's like $80, right?
That was a lot.
So if you want to go back and look at a newspaper from that time and see what it cost to buy a car, to buy a new suit, to buy a steak, to eat in a restaurant, you will realize that $80 was, to use a popular American term, a shitload of money. Exactly. It was a very, so that was but you could rent it. You didn't have to buy it. But for those who did, they were spending a fortune to buy that. So again, porn was never cheap. It was expensive. It's become cheap now because of the internet.
Yeah.
But it became much cheaper to produce. And so all the distributors said, the hell with 35 millimeter production and forget the movie theaters. We're done with it. And that's when all the movie theaters collapsed. That's when Times Square in New York collapsed, because those theaters all closed. And when those theaters closed, there were no businesses that could come into them. Nobody knew what to do with those old theaters. Exactly. So then Times Square became nothing but a big, empty, abandoned place full of drug addicts, drug dealing, because everything was closed. It wasn't the porno that brought the drugs. The porno was its own industry. When the porno was lucrative, when it was making money, then you didn't have as much trouble. But in the 80s, that's when Times Square turned into slime square, as they called it. And it was nothing but a place for drugs and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so we're coming close to the end of the interview now.
Shall we wrap it up? Have I told you enough?
Oh, well, I'm pretty sure we could talk for a couple of more hours, because there's a lot of things we can discuss. But I don't know, we may be in the future, because obviously
maybe in the future I'd be happy to.
Definitely. There's a lot of things I'm learning, as we speak, as we go, and because that's a fascinating subject, grindhouse and exploitation in general. So I'd like to thank you for your time, Michael, because
it's been a pleasure.
To be honest, I'm not sure how many people in Slovakia will appreciate that, that video we're doing now, because obviously you need to speak English to understand, and you need to know certain amount of stuff to understand what we're talking, like names or maybe
sure.
Yeah. But I think that people who do, they will really, really appreciate that, because there's a I'm not sure that there's anybody else in Slovakia like, doing this kind of like bringing the kind of information, which I consider very important, because this subject is still viewed, from our traditional like a viewpoint, like, oh, it's no, we don't speak to about it, it's all dirty, it's like a hush stuff. So I think it's about the time, as you mentioned, to give those cinematographers or performers they earned already, and they pay their dues, sometimes with the jail time, sometimes with ruined lives, because there were a couple of them. And it has to be said that many of them actually ended in poverty, basically.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Penniless.
But maybe some of the people who controlled the exhibition
Yeah.
made money and lived in nice houses and retired with money, but hardly anybody on the filmmaking side actually wound up with any money in the bank.
Yeah.
I can tell you that for a fact.
Yeah. So that's
and also I might mention that my interest in these films has very little to do with the sex aspect. If all of the stuff we were talking about had remained illegal, that would have been fine with me. I just would have been studying something that was done illegally.
Yeah.
I'm not this kind of guy who's out there to champion the quote First Amendment right to make porn. I'm not entirely sure there is a First Amendment right in America to make porn. But I did find that there were some very talented and sincere filmmakers working in that part of the film business in the 60s and 70s. And I've just wanted to give those people their credit. That's what my entire career has been about. And I think if you check out some of their films, once you get over the sex aspect and you look at the filmmaking aspect, I think you'll see something of value.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Okay, so that's all, as they say in this cartoons, and that's all, folks. Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, for your time, and I wish you all the best. And we're staying in touch. So if you have some news like in the books or any articles, just let me know, and we can talk about them again.
Absolutely. I appreciate the fact that you want to share this information. I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to do it, and I'm happy to help you with any other subjects I know anything about. It's great that you're doing this.
Okay, so to anybody watching that, thank you for your time as well, and see you soon. Bye bye.